Hello, this is Michel Leviathan Sorbet and this is a new episode of Wojennik TV. Today I would like to show you a review of a prototype of a game which will hopefully be published in 2021. But first, the game has to be funded successfully on Kickstarter. This game is called Domination and it is another project of the Polish publisher PHALANX. Domination is a re-implementation of Mini World War II, a game published in 2019 and designed by Wojennik. This is a game which will enable us to recreate the titanic struggle of World War II. This will be a game for 2 to 4 players who will competitively, but in teams of 2, try to overcome their opponents and win this conflict. The game will be using some of the mechanics which were used in Mini World War II, but the rules were redesigned, some new elements were added, and additionally the components will be of a greater scale. This is a game which is very abstract in the way that it represents the whole Second World War in a very minimalistic way, in the same way that Mini World War II tried to do it. The time of play is extremely attractive because it is somewhere from 90 to 120 minutes, so for a game representing the whole Second World War, it is extremely pleasant. Today I would like to show you how the elements of the prototype of this game look like, then I would like to briefly explain what are the core concepts of the game, and at the end I would like to give you my initial thoughts about this title and to underline its weaker and stronger points. So let's begin. Here is Domination, prepared to play a new game. At first I would like to show you how the components of this prototype look like and what are the core mechanics of this title. As mentioned earlier, mind that this is a prototype version, so what you're seeing right now is its current state. It might change the quality of the elements, some graphic elements will probably be different, but I believe that the core mechanics and the core concepts will remain the same. Now, the first and most obvious element that we receive in Domination is the game board. As you can see, this is a square board which in fact depicts all the world because it is a map which shows us the Earth from the North Pole perspective. So we have Europe, then we have Asia, we have Australia and the Pacific Ocean, and finally we have the Americas. So this is somewhat a representation of the whole globe. In Domination, 2 blocks will be opposed. The first one will be the axis composed of the German power and the Japanese Empire. The Germans have also their Italian ally who can switch sides during the game. The opposing alliance is composed of the Soviet Union and of the British Empire. Now, the British Empire is in a special situation because it is present both in its own part of the globe, if I might say so, so in Europe and in Northern America, but it is also present in Asia, where it has its Indian and Burman colonies. So all the sides are present in one side of the board, whereas the British are pretty much everywhere. The British also are allied to France, but France, just as Italy, can switch sides if it was successfully invaded by the Axis, by the Germans or by the Japanese. We also get 2 major powers which do not start the game allied to others. We get the United States of America, present on the board but neutral, and the Chinese, which also are neutral at the game's start. Those 2 major powers can join the Western Alliance and become part of
the Western Alliance in case they become attacked by the Axis and their level of commitment reaches the end of their track, because both sides have their corresponding tracks and a set of cards which can be activated and added to the stack. So those two sides become neutral, but then because of Western politics or because of Axis invasions can become part of the Western Alliance. Each player will receive his, her or her own set of counters, and there will be 3 types of those counters representing units. So the first one will be land units, which will be represented by tanks. The second type of units will be air fleets, represented by plane miniatures. And finally, we get also fleets, which are represented by small miniatures representing ships. We get also neutral powers forces, which are represented by white miniatures, and they will be set at the game start on certain spaces. When talking of spaces, the game board, as you can see, is divided into spaces, and we get 3 kinds of spaces. The square ones will be land spaces. The round ones with those circles will be the island spaces, and finally the third type will be coastal spaces. The difference between them is that on land spaces only ground forces and air fleets can end their movement. On coastal areas everything can be stacked, and on island spaces only fleets, air fleets or ships can end their movement. We get rules governing stacking. Normally it will be 2 units per space, unless this is a big free-stud space where up to 4 units can be stacked. The game board, as you can see, has also some connections between spaces, because we, as you can see, get some arrows between those spaces, and those arrows show us from which space we can travel to what space. So for instance, if there is no connection between those 2 spaces, I cannot move directly from one space to another. I have to find another way, probably here. Those arrows show us the directions of potential movement. At the same time, those arrows can be of 2 different colors. The brown ones indicate that the first unit that we move through such an arrow has to be a land unit. In case of blue arrows, the first unit which travels through such an arrow has to be a fleet, so a naval unit. Now, this is a way to simulate, for instance, landings, amphibious landings, because, for instance, here to invade southern Italy, we have to use amphibious assault. So first launching a naval unit and then only travel or continue our attack with ground forces. The spaces, as you can see, contain also the star symbols, which indicate the number of victory points attributed to a power controlling such a space. When talking of control, you always control the spaces of your home nation. If you want to control a neutral space or a space controlled by an opposing power at game start, you have to keep a unit on such a space. As long as you do, this space grants you the number of points corresponding to the number of stars on this space. The moment you decide to move such a unit from such a space, you also lose the point. You get also some different symbols on some spaces. Those will be harbors or factories. Factories can produce land units and air fleets, so those will be the spaces where you can build those units, whereas harbors or shipyards will be places where you can place fleets. So it is important to control also spaces which enable you to rebuild your units, because you will be losing a lot of them during this game. On this board we find also the victory point track. As you can see, each major nation has its own corresponding counter, and those counters will be moved along this track. Each time a side loses or gains points, this counter will move in accordance to the number of points gained or lost. The playing board also contains space for the playing deck, for the discard deck, for the American and Chinese cards, and for the turn track. As you can see, we can play from 1939 up to 1945. If the game ends in a draw in 1945, it's the Axis who wins the game, because at the end of each turn we will add the number of points of the Axis, so both of the Japanese as of the Germans, and we will add the number of points possessed by the British and the Soviets. Then we will compare those totals to the minimum number of points required to automatically win the game. In 1939, both sides have to accumulate 32 points in order to win. But then, with each year, this number of points will change. The Axis in 1940 needs only 31 points, whereas the Western Allies need 33 points. So the difference will increase with each year. This is a way to simulate how the war went, and the Axis are on the offensive at the game start. But then, when we play several turns, it's the Western and Soviet forces which will slowly be taking control. So at the game's end in 1945, the Soviets and the British need 38 points to win, whereas the Axis need only 26. So when playing the game, the global situation on the board will change. At first, the Axis will be trying to take control of a lot of places. Then it will be the counteroffensive of the British, of the Soviets, probably of the Americans, who will be slowly retaking the lost territories. Each player receives also one very important additional element. This element is the technology board. Because in the game we will not only build units, we will also invest in technology. As you can see, we get several technologies of different colors. Now those technologies will be used in order, for instance, to reduce the cost of moving units, to reduce the cost of launching attacks, to reduce the cost of placing new units. The same applies to fleets. There will be technologies enabling us to launch V1 missiles or V2 or even nuclear weapons. There will be technologies related to the Enigma system or to espionage. There will be also second-level technologies which can be developed only if we manage to develop the first-level technologies. So a lot of things is possible, but what is even more important is that you won't be able to develop each technology during the game. As you can see, the game will last from 1939 to 1945, but during each of those years, you will be able to develop only one single technology. You can see that there is a lot more technologies than years. So during the game, you'll have to carefully decide which technology to develop, which path to choose, at what things you should be specialized, and developing those technologies will also influence your style of play and your priorities during a turn. Developing technologies can grant you also additional points, because developing two technologies of different colors grants you 1 point. 3 colors means 2 points, then 3 and 4, so it's also an additional way to get some points. Now, how a turn of domination looks like. Well, the first and most important element of a turn is the draft phase, during which each player will receive a certain number of cards. This number of cards is indicated on the turn track. As you can see, we have a number showing the number of cards which each player received at the start of each year. In 1939 and in 1941, the Germans and the Japanese will receive one additional card. This is a way to simulate, first of all, the Germans' blitzkrieg in 1939 and finally the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. They get one additional card. Each player will receive this number of cards, and they will choose one of those cards to keep in their hand. Then they will give the rest of the cards to their neighbor. Their neighbor will keep one card, and they will transmit the others to their neighbor. So each player will draft a hand of cards, finally receiving 2 cards from their neighbor, keeping one and discarding the other. How those cards look like? Well, those cards are divided into 3 sections. The first one, as you can see, is the number of operation points that such a card grants us when played. Those operations can be used in order to do operations, and the most obvious operations will be moving units, will be launching attacks, or placing new units. The cost is printed on the technology board, but if you develop a technology, this price might change. So for instance, developing the technology allowing you to launch cheaper attacks will require you then to spend only 2 operation points to launch fleet attacks, whereas at the game starts it will be 3. So using those operation points, you can move units, you can attack, you can place new units. The second possibility is also to place a technology, because each card, as you can see, has a symbol which corresponds to one of the technologies present on the technology board. You can develop only one technology per turn, so you choose the corresponding technology from those that you have on your hand. You place this card face down without showing it to other players, and you wait up until the turns end to uncover this technology and to indicate your new technology on your technology board. The final section of the card has a space with a color corresponding to the 4 powers. So this might be a Soviet card, this might be a Japanese card, this might be also a British card, or finally this might be a German card. Only the nation whose color is presented on the bottom of the card can use this section of the card. So for instance, here only the British can use this card, whereas here it will be only the Japanese. Those sections enable you, for instance, to get additional points for over alliances. It can be also a bonus operation point. So each player, each side using this card will get only 3 operation. But if you are the British, you can receive 4 operation points. You can place new units without spending any operation points, and again move a unit without paying. You can grab a technology from the discard pile. You can also receive additional bonuses. For instance, you can have the opportunity to place resistance markers on terrain occupied by the Axis. So those resistance tokens will be placed on such spaces, decreasing the number of points that such a space grants to its controller. You can place Axis powers, puppet forces, or place air fleets, etc. So those will be powerful bonuses. After the draft ends, each player can also discard one card and draw a replacement card from the deck. At this point, players can also use their special technologies, because some technologies enable you to, for instance, look at opponents' cards and force them to discard cards, or to draw more cards when discarding cards and choosing one of those drawn cards. So those technologies not only will influence the cost of making some actions, it can also influence the possibility to get additional opportunities when drawing cards, or even forcing your opponent to discard cards, because for instance the V2 or the nuclear weapons can force players to discard 2 or even 3 cards. After each player ends with the draft phase with discarding and drawing, it's time to play their turn. The turn track indicates also which power starts each turn. So for instance, in 1949, the Germans will go first, followed by the British, then by the Japanese and by the Soviets. In 1940, it will be the British, then the Japanese, the Soviets, and finally the German, who will play. During the turn, a force has to play one of their cards or pass, but passing means ending their turn. They cannot do anything more. So as long as you have some cards, you should play the cards and decide which section of the card you will be using. Then it's your opponent, then the third side, etc. Now, how moving units or attacking works. Moving units is extremely simple because you can move units all alongside your starting areas and also control spaces, and you can just put your unit into a free space. But you have to keep your units in supply. So if, for instance, those two spaces were free, I couldn't move directly to Poland because this unit would be out of supply. It wouldn't be able to trace a connected path towards its, well, it would be able to connect, it has to be connected to its natal, to one of its natal spots. So for instance, I wouldn't be able to move here because this space is not connected to my starting spots. But if I controlled also Romania, I could very well move up here. Now there are also some special connections between spaces. As you can see, those two spaces are connected one to another. Those two also because of those big arrows, which are special connections. So moving, as I said earlier, is extremely simple. Attack is even simpler because you can attack a unit which is adjacent to your unit. You just declare such an attack and you remove a unit after paying a required number of operation points. This is that easy. You do not roll any dice, you do not draw or play additional cards, you do not use any modifiers or CRTs, you just take off the corresponding units, which of course can be rebuilt by your opponent during his or her turn. Each player launches attacks, moves his units, scores points for controlled territories, and each player plays cards up until everyone passes. Each player can also keep one card during at their turns end, and when all players are done, the turn ends. We sum up the number of points possessed by each player. We can launch. We can also uncover the technologies played, and we end the turn playing anew. Now there are other mechanics, such as, for instance, submarines, because the Axis can use U-boats to reduce the number of points granted by both the Caribbean and the Atlantic spaces, or to also hinder supply. There are also rules governing, as I said earlier, resistance units, or there are also other elements, such as, for instance, the possibility of Italy or France switching sides. But I won't be explaining all of them right now. Rather, I'd like to give you my opinion about this game. I would like to tell you a few words about what I think are the strong and a little bit weaker points of Domination.
At first, I would like to once more underline that today I have shown you the prototype version of Domination. The final version of this game might be a little bit different, both in terms of the quality and the number of components included, as well as in the term of some minor mechanics changes, because the final version will be produced in accordance how the campaign ends. So I strongly recommend you consult both the PHALANX webpage or the Kickstarter campaign page in order to get more details, in order to browse through the updates, where you can read about the changes or the final elements which are to be included in the published version of Domination. Having said that, I would like now to tell you a few words about what I think are the strong and a little bit weaker points of this title. Now, what I really like in Domination is the fact that you get a game covering the whole World War II in a very minimalistic way. This is the same approach that we had in Mini World War II, but here we have somewhat a bigger scale, because you get a bigger map, you get the draft mechanic, you get the additional components, you get, for instance, the technology tree. So the elements which were the strong elements of Mini World War II are still here, but in a more detailed way. So I would say that a very strong point of Domination is its very pleasant, quite elegant interface, because this is a game quite easy to learn with some easy mechanics, at the same time offering a lot of decisions, and also a game in which you will carefully have to cooperate with your teammate. This is a game which can be played both in a group of 2, 3 or 4 players, and it is extremely interesting in each of those situations. I said that you have to cooperate very carefully with your teammate. It might seem surprising that Germans and Japanese can cooperate very closely and obtain some advantages. Well, it all depends on your strategy, because you can cooperate in different ways. It is important to decide, for instance, if to concentrate on the British or on the Soviet Union, how to help your teammate by distracting opposing forces in a region. Playing certain cards or keeping them in our hand will hinder the player next to us, or maybe we can try to bring a strong card to our teammate during the draft. So there are many ways, and I like it a lot, because thanks to it, this is a real cooperation. This is not a game in which 4 players will play only for their own and finally sum their points and maybe win together. We really have to play together and win or lose together. I like it a lot. I said that the rules are quite simple. They are, because the game is quite minimalistic, but in a positive sense, because this is a game which I said that tries to simulate the whole Second World War conflict. This is a huge thing to do. This is very difficult. This was such a long, such a complex conflict taking place in such many places that it is very difficult to create a game playable in 90 to 120 minutes, which will enable us to recreate all the World War II from 1939 to 1945. Mini World War II and Domination achieve this goal in terms of enabling us to play an interesting, intense game, which is still a Second World War II representation, because while playing this game you'll get this feeling because of a lot of additional elements which are added to this game, which really make you feel that this is World War II. Beginning from the sides and the obvious elements which are the components, you get also a lot of mechanics which really influence the fact that you feel that you're playing a Second World War II game. The most important one, in my opinion, is the technology track, because this is a fantastic addition to the game which enhances a lot what we found in Mini World War II. Here you get the technology tree with, for instance, V1s, V2s, the nuclear weapons, Enigma, things which instantly make you think of World War II. At the same time, what I really like in this technology tree is that it is not too complex, and that you will not be able to develop every technology. And I love it, because you cannot develop everything. You won't have the time. You have to concentrate on certain aspects of this technology tree in order to develop what you think will be the best technologies in order to gain advantage over your opponent. And not always developing naval skills will be the best for Japan. Not always developing V1s or V2s, for instance, from the German point of view, will be the best option. You'll have to carefully decide which technology to take. At the same time, also, you have to be flexible, because the technologies that you develop will depend on the cards that you receive during the draft. And if you draft poorly in terms of obtaining those elements, well, you'll have to maybe change your strategy and adapt. what I really like is the draft. As I said earlier, this adds another depth, it adds another layer to this interesting game, because choosing the correct assets at each turn start is key to being efficient during your turn. You have to decide if you want to take strong cards in terms of operation points, or maybe cards associated to your own superpower, or maybe cards which are needed to develop technologies, or maybe cards which will hinder your opponent. So a lot of options, a lot of decisions to take. And this is one of the reasons why Domination is such an interesting game, because at the turn start, you'll get your assets which you'll have to use during your turn. You'll have to decide if you want to keep a card, how to use your cards, if you want to play operations, if you want to develop a technology. A lot of options are there, and I love it because it also increases the replay value of this title. I very like the fact that each of the 4 major powers is very different. This is a very asymmetrical game. Both teams will have different strong points and weaker points, both due to the number of units, both due to number of terrain occupied at game start, and also due to the structure of the cards. Some cards will be stronger, some cards will be weaker. You'll find, for instance, strong Soviet cards, a little bit weaker British cards, etc. Each side has its strong and weaker points, and this is another reason why you should very carefully cooperate with your teammate. So what I think are the little bit weaker points of Domination. After playing a few games, I'd say that there are 2 things which are related to the game board, and 1 thing which is related to the designing philosophy of this title. So the 2 issues which are related to the way how the board is designed are as follows. The first one is the fact that this is, as I said, try to recreate World War II on a board game, but it would be much more pleasant, in my opinion. It would be more attractive if the spaces on the board had their own names. Now here we have only coastal areas, we have islands and land areas. Very abstract. You get the picture of the country or of the region, so you see that you are attacking France or you are taking Poland. But it would be even more attractive if we got the names. It would be much more interesting to invade Poland, sing the name Poland on the board, or for instance launching an attack against Hawaii. Here, for people who know geography, who know the history of World War II, it's not a major issue, but I think it would be much better to add those names in order to add another element which could bring us to the conclusion that this is a second World War II game. The second aspect which bothered me during my plays is the fact that the factory and shipyard symbols, icons, are sometimes hidden inside those boxes. If we place units on those boxes, those symbols tend to become hidden, and sometimes it was an issue because I had to very carefully look at those boxes in order to see if my opponent is able to place something more on such a space. Well, not a big problem if you well know the game, because when you know the game, you will remember that some places, for instance, Ukraine enables you to place units, some others don't. But when discovering this game, this would be a great help if those symbols were just like the stars, put next to the spots or maybe on the borders. This would be very helpful, and I found it irritating to check those spaces each time, so take off the units and verify if this is a spot where I can recruit. The third element, which is related to the philosophy of design, is the fact that I said that this game is very minimalistic. It is abstract in many ways, because Many wargamers are used to games in which you will be using combat resolution tables, die rolls, modifiers, cards, which will influence the efficiency of combat of some units. Here, combat is extremely abstract, it's extremely minimalistic. The same applies to recruitment, the same applies to movement, and there are many ways in which this game simplifies games which are complicated or sometimes overly complicated in other games. This will suit a lot of persons, but there will be a group of players who will say this is too simple, this is too abstract, this is totally disconnected with the way that war was really fought. And sometimes they will be right, because movement which enables you to move a unit directly from Moscow almost to Tokyo in one move is quite abstract. Fights or battles fought just by removing a unit adjacent to your own one will be totally minimalistic. So some hardcore grognards might find this game too simple and too minimalistic. Having said that, I believe that this is a sacrifice which was compulsory in order to simulate the whole Second World War in a very short time of play, because creating a game which enables you to play the whole Second World War in 90 to 120 minutes is really an objective very difficult to achieve. Wojennik achieved this by making some sacrifices, by choosing to be minimalistic in some aspects. This is something which enables us a better gameplay, a better game dynamic, but at the same time it reduces a certain amount of historical accuracy. Well, the balance is, in my opinion, at a correct level, because as I said earlier, we get a lot of elements which increase Chrome in this game, and thanks to it, you do not have this total disconnection between playing a game which is not a war game simulating Second World War. It's still a game in which you will feel this climate. I think it is a very interesting design, a design which is a game with a great replay value, with huge dynamics, a game which can suit a lot of you, not only wargamers, because due to this abstract feeling of Second World War, it will also appeal to non-wargamers. And this is always a nice thing, because this is a game which can be used to attract additional players to enter our hobby. So if you have the opportunity, I strongly recommend you check this project, maybe back it on Kickstarter. Take also a look at PHALANX page and other Kickstarter campaign page, where you can find additional information about this project. This was the review of the prototype of Domination, which has a chance to be published by PHALANX and which is currently on Kickstarter. I hope you will also revisit our channel and take a look at other videos. We have other reviews and unboxings. I hope you have a fantastic day, and see you next time.